Sometimes the loneliest people live in the biggest houses, and sometimes the strongest hearts are hidden behind the highest walls. Out in 1880s Texas, the dust and the heat could bake the hope right out of a person. For the wealthy widow Lucinda Hale, that hope had turned to dust a long time ago. She had a grand stone mansion that cast a shadow over 15,000 acres of land. But inside, her heart was as empty as the unused rooms. She had everything money could buy, but she had nothing her soul truly needed. Not until a starving giant of a man appeared at her front gate, his shadow falling long and hungry across her manicured lawn. He asked for nothing more than a meal in exchange for a day of honest work, a simple bargain. Lucinda fed him out of pity, a small act of mercy in a world that had shown her none. But what she got in return was something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Because Cade Mercer wasn't just any drifter. He was a ghost, a man with a past so dark, so violent, that powerful enemies would kill, and kill again, to keep it buried. When cattle rustlers and blood feuds threaten to burn everything Lucinda has built to the ground, that simple bargain she made with a hungry cowboy becomes a desperate fight for survival, for love, and for a redemption that might just cost them both their lives. The question is, will the man she saved end up being the one to save her, or will he be the one to destroy everything she has left? The story you're about to hear is a wild ride through the heart of the Old West, a place where loyalty is paid for in blood, and the only thing more dangerous than a man with a gun is a man with a secret. The morning sun hit the windows of the Hale Ranch mansion, making the stone walls glow. Lucinda stood on the wraparound porch, a cup of coffee in her hands. It was barely 7 in the morning, but the Texas air was already thick with a heat that promised to be cruel. From here, she could see her whole empire, or what was left of it. Rolling hills dotted with mesquite trees that looked like gnarled old men. Endless stretches of golden grassland that were now more brown than gold. And the thin, silver ribbon of Deadman's Creek, the very creek that had given the nearby town its grim name during the cholera outbreak of '74. The creek was dying, just like her ranch. She twisted the simple gold band on her left ring finger, a habit she couldn't break, not in the 3 years since her husband Thomas had died. The fever took him fast. It had taken the best parts of her with him. The ring was loose now. She'd lost weight. Rosa, her cook and the closest thing she had to a mother, insisted on cooking for a dozen ranch hands every day, but Lucinda mostly just pushed the food around her plate. At 28, she was a prize, beautiful, with auburn hair that caught the sun like fire and green eyes that held a sharp intelligence that scared off most suitors. But her heart was a stone. Thomas had been her everything, childhood sweetheart, business partner, best friend. When he was gone, the world went quiet. "Senora Lucinda, you need to eat," Rosa's voice called from the kitchen. The woman had been with the family forever, her loyalty as solid as the stone walls of the house. "I'm not hungry, Rosa," Lucinda called back, her voice flat. The Hale Ranch was sprawled across 15,000 acres of what used to be the best grazing land in Texas. But 3 years of drought had turned it into a wasteland. The grass was sparse and yellow. The creek was a ghost of its former self. She'd been forced to sell off more than half her cattle, keeping only the best breeding stock, praying for rain that never came. Miguel Rodriguez, her foreman, came around the corner of the house. His face, weathered by decades under the Texas sun, was etched with worry. He'd worked for Thomas since they were boys. His loyalty was to the Hale name, and that name was now hers. "Morning, Senora," he said, taking off his hat. "We lost another calf. Coyotes got through the fence again." Lucinda sighed. Every loss was a gut punch. "How many this month?" "7, Miguel said grimly. "And that's just the ones we found." The ranch that once employed 30 men now ran on a skeleton crew of 8. Miguel, Rosa, and 6 loyal hands who stayed on even when their pay was late. They were all tied to her, their fates bound to the success or failure of this ranch. If she went down, They all went down with her. "Any word from Bartholomew Cross?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Cross owned the neighboring ranch. He was a vulture circling a dying animal. His offers to buy her out had started polite, but they'd gotten colder, more demanding. Last month, he'd even suggested marriage, a business merger disguised as romance. The thought made her skin crawl. "He rode by yesterday," Miguel said, his voice tight. "Left another letter." Lucinda's jaw tightened. Cross was persistent, handsome in a cruel, calculating way, and utterly ruthless. Stories followed him like a bad smell. Homesteaders who refused to sell found their wells fouled, their cattle vanished. Nothing was ever proven, of course. Men like Cross were too smart for that. "He said he heard talk of rustlers," Miguel added. "Said he was concerned for your safety." The irony was so thick you could choke on it. Cross worrying about rustlers was like a wolf offering to guard the henhouse, but the threat was real. With the drought hitting everyone, desperate men were turning to stealing cattle to feed their families. "Double the night watch," Lucinda ordered. "Shoot first, ask questions later." "Si, señora. What about the letter?" "Burn it," she said, her voice like ice. "Burn it with the others." The house behind her was a monument to a past that felt like a dream. 3 stories of native stone and imported timber, crystal chandeliers in rooms that were always dark, Persian rugs on floors that echoed with the footsteps of just one lonely woman. They had planned for children, for a house full of life and laughter. 3 miscarriages had broken that dream, and then the fever had taken Thomas. Now the house was a beautiful, cold tomb. The isolation was a physical weight. The town of Deadman's Creek was 20 miles of rough road away. Her few friends had stopped visiting after she'd refused their attempts at matchmaking. She was an anomaly, a woman alone, powerful, and unwilling to be fixed. She had built walls around her heart, not out of spite, but for survival. To lose someone like she'd lost Thomas again would shatter her. As she turned to go inside, she saw her reflection in the glass of the front door. The face of the girl Thomas had married was still there, but it was thinner now, with lines of worry around the eyes. The girl who believed in happy endings was gone. In her place was a woman who had learned that life was about one thing and one thing only: endurance. And she wondered, in the quiet, dusty corners of her mind, if she would ever truly feel alive again. She'd grown so used to just surviving, she'd almost forgotten how to live. Almost, but not quite. And that small difference was about to change everything. The afternoon sun was a hammer, beating down on the parched earth. Lucinda rode her mare, Duchess, along the southern fence line. The heat shimmered off the ground in waves, making the distant hills dance. She'd started doing these inspections herself. She needed to see the decay firsthand, to feel the urgency of it. The fence posts were leaning, the wire snapped in places where thirsty cattle had pushed through, desperate for better grazing that didn't exist. Each break was another bill she couldn't afford, another job for her overworked men. She dismounted, running a gloved hand over the twisted metal. That's when she saw him. At first, he was just a speck on the horizon, a dark shape moving through the heat haze. But he walked with a steady, relentless pace, and as he got closer, his size became apparent. He was a giant, well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to block out the sun. His clothes were rags, a torn shirt, worn-out denim, but they hung on a frame that spoke of immense, coiled strength. Lucinda swung back onto Duchess, her hand moving instinctively to the small pistol in her saddlebag. A woman alone couldn't be too careful. But there was something odd about his approach. He wasn't hiding. He was walking straight for her, as if he had an appointment. When he was 50 yards out, he stopped and raised a hand. "Ma'am," he called out. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone. It was the voice of an educated man, not a common drifter. "I mean you no harm." She studied him, her finger resting on the trigger of her pistol. Common sense screamed at her to ride away, to send Miguel and the boys back to deal with him. But his posture, respectful, patient, desperate, held her there. "You can speak from there," she called back. "What do you want?" He took off his wide-brimmed hat, revealing a tangle of dark hair and a face that was all sharp angles and hollow cheeks. His eyes were a startling pale blue, the color of a winter sky. And in those eyes, she saw intelligence and a raw dignity that poverty hadn't managed to erase. "My name is Cade Mercer," he said, his voice steady despite his obvious exhaustion. "I haven't eaten in 3 days, ma'am. I'm asking for a meal, in exchange for honest work. I can mend fences, break horses, handle cattle, whatever you need." The request was so simple, so direct it caught her off guard. Men who came to her gate usually wanted something more. They wanted her land, her money, her hand in marriage. This man just wanted to earn a meal. "You're a long way from anywhere, Mr. Mercer," she said. A shadow flickered across his face. "Lost my horse, snakebite, been walking ever since." It was a plausible story, but Lucinda sensed it wasn't the whole story. The way he held himself, the quality of his voice, this man was no ordinary cowhand. He carried himself like a man who was used to giving orders, not taking them. "I have men for the ranch work," she said, testing him. "I'm sure you do, ma'am, but I see your fence needs mending, and I'd wager there's more work on a place this size than you have hands to do it. I'm not asking for charity, just a fair trade." As if on cue, his stomach let out a ferocious growl that echoed in the still air. A faint flush of red crept up his neck. He was mortified. Against her better judgment, she dismounted again. Something about this man pulled at her. Maybe it was the contrast between his desperation and his pride. Or maybe, just maybe, she recognized a fellow survivor. "Show me your hands," she commanded. He held them out, palms up. They were the hands of a working man, calloused and scarred. But they were clean. His nails were trimmed. This was a man who held onto his standards, even in ruin. "You know horses?" "Yes, ma'am. Raised and trained them most of my life." "Cattle. Worked my share of drives." She looked him over again. His saddlebags, slung over one massive shoulder, were high-quality leather, battered but expensive. The buckles were tarnished silver. This man had seen better days, much better days. "What happened to you, Mr. Mercer?" she asked softly. His jaw tightened. Those pale blue eyes looked past her, toward a horizon only he could see. "Made some enemies, ma'am," he said, his voice low. "Sometimes being right isn't enough." The answer was cryptic, but it rang with a hard-earned truth. In that moment, Lucinda made a decision that surprised even herself. "Can you ride bareback?" "If I have to." "Then let's go. You'll get your meal, and we'll see about the work." She paused, her eyes locking onto his. "But understand this, Mr. Mercer. I run a respectable ranch. Any trouble, any theft, any disrespect, and you'll be walking again. Understood?" "Understood, ma'am. You won't regret this." "We'll see about that," she said. As they made their way back to the ranch house, Lucinda on her horse and the giant walking alongside, she found herself stealing glances at him. There was a story here. A dark one. Men like Cade Mercer didn't just fall from grace. They were pushed. And as he walked, his heavy saddlebags bounced against his hip. For a second, a leather flap shifted, and she saw a stack of papers tucked inside. He quickly adjusted the bag, hiding them from view. She had just invited a mystery onto her land, and mysteries, in her experience, had a way of turning into trouble. Rose's reaction was immediate. The moment Cade stepped into her kitchen, she clucked her tongue like a mother hen. She saw his gaunt face, the hollows in his cheeks, and her maternal instincts took over. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to a chair. "You look like a scarecrow." She piled a plate high with leftover beef, warm bread, and a heap of preserved peaches. Cade sat, but he didn't eat. Not until Lucinda gave him a nod of approval. His manners were impeccable. He ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every bite. This was a gentleman, fallen on hard times. Miguel appeared in the doorway, his face a thundercloud of suspicion. "Señora, a word." On the back porch, Miguel didn't waste time. You know nothing about this man. He could be a killer. He could also be exactly what he says he is, Lucinda countered. A man down on his luck. Men like that don't speak like they've been to college, Miguel shot back. And they don't carry silver-buckled saddlebags? He's hiding something. The rustlers have been hitting us hard. What if he's a scout for them, getting the lay of the land? The thought was a cold knot in her stomach. It made perfect sense. But something in her refused to believe it. Give him a chance, she said, her voice firm. Put him on the south fence line. If he's a scout for rustlers, he'll have to repair our defenses to keep his cover. We'll see how he likes that. Miguel grunted, unconvinced. Where does he sleep? Not in the bunkhouse with my men. The old line shack by the creek, she decided. It's isolated. He can't cause trouble from there. For the rest of the day, Lucinda found reasons to ride by the south pasture. What she saw was both impressive and deeply unsettling. Cade worked with a brutal efficiency. He didn't just patch the broken wires, he assessed the entire fence line, identifying weak points, reinforcing posts, thinking strategically. He was working like a man defending a fortress. More than that, he seemed to know things. As he worked, she saw him looking at the land, his eyes tracing the contours of the hills, the dry creek beds. At one point, she saw him stop and stare at a rocky outcrop near the eastern boundary, a strange, calculating look on his face. It was a piece of land she never paid much attention to. But he stared at it for a full 5 minutes, as if he knew something about it that she didn't. It was a chilling thought. How could a complete stranger know her land so well? That evening, a small fire flickered near the line shack. Rosa had insisted on sending him a plate of biscuits, and Lucinda found herself walking toward the creek, using the food as an excuse. She found him staring into the flames, a look of profound loneliness on his face. You did good work today, she said. It felt good to be useful, he replied. Mr. Mercer, she began, deciding to press him. Miguel is concerned. He thinks you might be here to scout for the rustlers. He looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting hers in the firelight. There was no shock, no denial, just a sad, weary acceptance. I understand his concern, he said quietly, but I promise you, ma'am, I'm not here to harm you or this ranch. He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. I used to have a spread of my own, south of here. Lost it. How? I testified against the wrong men, he said, his voice flat and hard. They had friends, powerful friends. They took everything. The story fit. It explained the sadness in his eyes, the caution in his voice. But it didn't explain how he knew her land. It didn't explain the way he looked at that rocky outcrop. Get some rest, Mr. Mercer, she said, turning to leave. Mrs. Hale, he called after her. Thank you. For the food, the work, and for not asking more questions than I'm ready to answer. As she walked back to the big, empty house, she knew he was right. She wasn't asking the right questions. She was afraid of the answers, because every instinct told her that the giant of a man she'd taken in was not a scout for a simple gang of rustlers. He was something far more dangerous. And he hadn't found her ranch by accident. He had come here for a reason, and she had a terrible feeling it had something to do with that worthless patch of rocks on the eastern boundary. By the end of the first week, Cade had repaired the entire southern fence line. It was stronger than it had ever been. He worked with a relentless, single-minded focus that both impressed and unnerved Miguel. He's a good worker. I'll give him that, the foreman admitted grudgingly. But I still don't trust him. Last night I saw him down by the creek, pacing, not like a man who's tired, like a soldier planning a campaign. Lucinda felt a chill. She'd seen it too. The strategic mind behind the quiet exterior. Then came the morning that changed everything. A commotion erupted from the main corral. Thunder, her prize stallion, a magnificent black horse worth a small fortune, was in a blind panic. He was rearing, kicking, his eyes wide with terror. He'd been spooked by a rattlesnake during the night. "He's going to kill himself!" Miguel shouted, as the ranch hands scrambled to stay clear of the horse's deadly hooves. Thunder was more than just an animal. He was the last major purchase Thomas had made, a symbol of the future they were supposed to have. Losing him would be like losing another piece of her husband. Suddenly, Cade was there. He moved to the edge of the corral, his movements calm and deliberate. "May I?" he asked Lucinda, his voice low. She nodded, desperate. Cade didn't climb into the corral. He just stood by the fence and began to speak. His voice was a low, rhythmic murmur, almost a chant. "Easy, big fellow. Easy now. You're safe." The horse's wild eyes flickered toward him. Its frantic movements began to slow. Cade continued to speak, his voice a mesmerizing, hypnotic wave of calm. Then he slowly pulled an old silver pocket watch from his vest. He let it dangle from its chain, the metal catching the morning sun. The gentle, rhythmic swaying of the watch seemed to lock the stallion's attention. The entire ranch stood in stunned silence. This wasn't just horse whispering. This was something else entirely. It was a display of absolute control, of a will so powerful it could soothe 1,000 pounds of panicked animal. In 20 minutes, Thunder was calmly eating oats from Cade's hand. The ranch hands broke into applause. Cade seemed embarrassed, quickly pocketing his watch and stepping back, becoming the humble drifter once more. But Lucinda had seen it. The transformation. In that moment, he hadn't been a hired hand. He'd been a commander. That night, she went to the line shack again. This time, her questions were pointed. "Where did you learn to do that with a horse?" He was quiet for a long moment. "My father bred horses for the Confederate cavalry," he said finally. "I grew up around them." It explained his manners, his speech, the son of a wealthy Virginia planter. But as he spoke, he pulled out the pocket watch, a nervous habit. In the firelight, she saw the engraving on the silver case, an ornate set of initials. They weren't CM, they were CAM. Her blood ran cold. He hadn't just been hiding his past, he had been hiding his name. "That's a beautiful watch," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked down at it, then quickly shoved it back in his pocket. "It was my father's," he said, his voice tight. As she walked back to the house, the pieces started to click into place, forming a terrifying picture. The military bearing, the strategic mind, the uncanny knowledge of her land. And now, a false name. Miguel was right. Cade was a soldier planning a campaign. But it wasn't a campaign for a band of rustlers. It was a campaign against her. And the prize he was after wasn't her cattle. It was the ranch itself. The question was why? Why would a man with his background, his skills, orchestrate such an elaborate deception? The answer had to be on her land. Hidden. Something valuable enough to lie for, and maybe even kill for. She thought of him staring at that rocky outcrop on the eastern boundary, a place everyone considered worthless. Everyone, perhaps, except Cade. She had to know what he was hiding. She had to know his real name. The next day, while Cade was working on the far side of the ranch, Lucinda did something she never thought she'd do. She went to the line shack and searched his meager belongings. His saddlebags were heavy. Inside, beneath a spare shirt, was the stack of papers she'd glimpsed before. They were geological maps, old, brittle surveys of her land, covered in handwritten notes and calculations. They all focused on one area, the rocky outcrop on the eastern boundary. The notes spoke of mineral deposits. Silver. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Thomas had never spoken of silver. Had he known? Had he hidden it? And then she found it, tucked into a leather-bound book. It wasn't a letter, it was a wanted poster. The drawing was rough, but the eyes were unmistakable, pale, intense, and piercing. It was Cade. But the name printed in bold letters at the top was not Cade Mercer. It was Cade Alexander McKinnon, wanted for treason against the United States, for aiding Confederate spies after the war, and for the murder of a Union captain. The bounty was $5,000, dead or alive. Lucinda stumbled out of the shack, the poster clutched in her hand, her world tilting on its axis. The man she had taken in, the man who had saved her prize stallion, the man whose quiet presence had started to fill the empty spaces in her life, was not just a drifter. He was a wanted traitor and a murderer. His story about losing his ranch to powerful enemies was a lie. He was a fugitive from the highest levels of the government, and he was on her ranch for a reason: the silver. He must have found out about it somehow. His entire act, the starving drifter, the helpful hand, it was all a charade to get close to the minerals he believed were his for the taking. He wasn't a scout for rustlers. He was a one-man army, here to claim a treasure he thought was hidden on her land. As she stood there, shaking, she saw a cloud of dust on the horizon. Riders, half a dozen of them, moving fast. At their head was Bartholomew Cross, but as they drew closer, she saw he wasn't alone. Riding beside him was a man she recognized from town: Sheriff Hayes, her own uncle, a man she had trusted her entire life. They rode straight into her yard and dismounted. Cross's eyes were cold and triumphant. Her uncle wouldn't look at her. "Lucinda," Cross said, his voice smooth as poison. "Sheriff Hayes and I have some business with your new hired hand." He held up a piece of paper. It was another wanted poster, identical to the one in her hand. "It seems you've been harboring a fugitive, a traitor and a murderer named Cade McKinnon." Her breath hitched. How did Cross know? How did he have the poster? Then she saw it, the look that passed between Cross and her uncle. A look of shared understanding, of conspiracy. It all crashed down on her at once, the rustling, the constant pressure from Cross. Her uncle, the sheriff, doing nothing to stop it. They weren't separate problems. They were all connected. Cross hadn't been trying to drive her out just for her land. He was after the silver, too. And her uncle, the man who was supposed to protect her, was his partner. They knew about the silver, and they knew Cade was here for it, too. This wasn't just a visit. It was a trap. They were here to eliminate their competition. They were here to kill Cade McKinnon. And she, Lucinda Hale, was standing right in the middle of it. She was no longer just a lonely widow trying to save her ranch. She was a witness. And in this part of Texas, witnesses had a nasty habit of disappearing. "Where is he, Lucinda?" Sheriff Hayes asked, his voice strained. He still wouldn't meet her eyes. She stared at her uncle, the man who had held her as a child, the man who had stood by her at Thomas's funeral. The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She thought of Miguel's warnings, of her own foolish, romantic notions about the mysterious stranger. She had been played by everyone. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, clutching the wanted poster behind her back. Cross smiled, a cold, predatory gleam in his eyes. "Don't play games, my dear. We know he's here. We know about the silver." The silver, the word hung in the air, a confirmation of her worst fears. This was never about grazing land. It was about a treasure hidden beneath her feet, a treasure she hadn't even known existed. "There's no silver," she lied, her voice trembling. "Isn't there?" Cross took a step closer. "My sources tell me otherwise. Sources that go all the way back to your husband." Thomas. The name was a dagger in her heart. Had Thomas known? Had he hidden this from her? Was this the real reason they were struggling? Had he been trying to protect the secret, even at the cost of the ranch? Before she could process the new wave of betrayal, a voice cut through the tension, deep and steady. "Looking for me." Cade McKinnon stepped out from behind the barn. He held a shovel in one hand, his face calm, his pale eyes moving from Cross to the sheriff, then finally to her. He saw the wanted poster in Cross's hand, and his expression didn't change. It was as if he'd been expecting this all along. "McKinnon," Cross spat. "I should have known you'd crawl out from under some rock eventually, after all these years." They knew each other. This wasn't a random intersection of fugitives and schemers. This was personal. "Still chasing ghosts, Cross?" Cade said, his voice deceptively mild. "This ghost is about to be exorcised," Cross snarled. "Sheriff, arrest this man." Sheriff Hayes drew his pistol, his hand shaking. "Cade McKinnon, you're under arrest for treason and murder." Cade didn't move. He just looked at Lucinda, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something she couldn't decipher. It wasn't fear. It was resignation, and something else. A warning. This was a carefully orchestrated play, and she was the only one who didn't know her lines. Cross and her uncle had come here today not just to arrest Cade, but to create a situation. A situation where a dangerous fugitive would resist arrest. A situation that would leave Cade dead and Cross in control of the silver. Lucinda's mind raced. She was surrounded, outgunned, and betrayed by her own family. Her only potential ally was a wanted traitor who had been lying to her from the moment he arrived. She had one choice. She could stand aside and let them kill him, let Cross take everything, or she could do the unthinkable. She could side with the fugitive. "He's my guest, Uncle Will," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "And he's under my protection. You are not arresting him on my land without a federal warrant." Sheriff Hayes flinched as if she'd slapped him. Cross just laughed. "Your protection?" he sneered. "My dear, you can't even protect your own cattle. What makes you think you can protect him?" He gestured to his men, who fanned out, their hands hovering over their guns. "This is no longer your land, Lucinda. It's mine, or it will be, once we've cleaned up the trash." Suddenly, Cade moved. It wasn't fast, but it was with a lethal purpose. He dropped the shovel and took a step in front of her, shielding her with his body. "This is between you and me, Cross," Cade said, his voice a low growl. "Leave her out of it." "I'm afraid she's been in it from the moment your husband decided to cross me," Cross replied, his eyes locked on Lucinda. Another bombshell. Thomas knew Cross. He hadn't just been a rival rancher. He'd been an enemy. Her whole life, the story she told herself about her marriage, her ranch, her place in the world, was a lie. A carefully constructed facade hiding a dark and deadly secret. "What did my husband do?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Cross's smile was cruel. "Your husband was a thief, Lucinda. He stole the geological surveys for this land right out from under me. He knew about the silver, and he was planning on cutting me out. His little fever was convenient." The implication was monstrous. Had Thomas's death not been from a fever at all? Had Cross arranged it? The world spun. Everything she thought she knew was gone, replaced by a terrifying new reality. She was alone, in the middle of a war she didn't understand, a war that had started long before she'd even known it existed. And the only person standing between her and a bullet was Cade McKinnon, a traitor, a murderer, a man who had just put his life on the line for hers. "Enough talk," Cross snarled, raising his pistol. "Kill him." The air exploded with the roar of gunfire. But the first shot didn't come from Cross's men. It came from the barn. Miguel, her loyal foreman, stood in the shadows of the barn door, a smoking rifle in his hands. One of Cross's men slumped from his saddle, a dark stain spreading across his chest. "Get the senora inside!" Miguel roared to the other ranch hands, who suddenly appeared at the windows of the bunkhouse, their own rifles blazing. Lucinda's skeleton crew, the men she could barely afford to pay, had chosen a side. They had chosen her. Cade grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "To the house! Now!" He dragged her toward the stone mansion as bullets whizzed past their heads, kicking up dust at their feet. They scrambled onto the porch and through the front door, slamming it shut just as a bullet splintered the wood where her head had been moments before. Panting, her heart hammering, she leaned against the door. Cade was already moving through the house, his eyes scanning the windows, his movements economical and precise. He wasn't a drifter. He was a soldier. "Get the rifles," he commanded, his voice all authority. "And stay away from the windows." She ran to the gun cabinet, her mind reeling. Miguel's loyalty, Cade's protection, Cross's confession. It was too much. "Why?" she gasped, handing him a Winchester. "Why are you helping me? You lied to me. You came here for the silver." He stopped loading the rifle and looked at her, his pale eyes burning with an intensity that stripped her bare. "I did lie to you, Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice low and raw. "But not about everything. Your husband, Thomas, he and I were in the same regiment during the war. He saved my life at Shiloh." Lucinda stared, speechless. "We found the survey maps together, after the war," Cade continued, his voice tight with memory. "It was supposed to be our future, a partnership. But Cross found out. He was our commanding officer, a man who used the war for his own profit. He thought the silver belonged to him." The pieces were slotting into place, each one more shocking than the last. "Thomas wrote to me a few months before he died," Cade said, his voice dropping. "He said Cross was closing in. He said he feared for his life. He told me if anything happened to him, I was to come here, to protect you, and to protect our claim. He hadn't come for the silver, not for himself. He had come to honor a debt to a dead friend. He had come to protect her." "The wanted poster," she whispered. "Cross arranged it," he said grimly. "The Union captain I supposedly murdered? He was one of Cross's cronies, a man we caught selling army supplies on the black market. Cross killed him to shut him up and framed me for it. He used his connections in Washington to have me declared a traitor. It made me a ghost, unable to claim my share, unable to show my face. The entire conspiracy was laid bare, a web of lies and betrayal that stretched back years, all orchestrated by one ruthless man. So you came here knowing Cross would eventually find you?" "It was the only way," Cade said. "I had to draw him out. I had to get him to show his hand. I just didn't expect to." He trailed off, looking at her. "I didn't expect to find you." The unspoken words hung between them, more powerful than the gunfire raging outside. A bullet shattered a window in the parlor, showering the Persian rug with glass. The siege had begun. Lucinda looked at the man before her. Cade McKinnon. Not a traitor, but a man betrayed. Not a murderer, but a man framed. And he was her last and only hope. "They'll burn us out," she said, her voice steady now, the fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "Not if we don't let them," Cade replied, handing her a loaded rifle. "You know this house better than anyone. Where are the weak points?" In that moment, she wasn't a lonely widow. She was a commander in her own home, fighting a war for her life, her legacy, and for the man who had crossed a continent to keep a promise. "There's a root cellar," she said, her mind clicking into tactical mode. "The entrance is hidden beneath the kitchen floor. It connects to an old irrigation tunnel that comes out by the creek." Cade's eyes lit up with a grim smile. "An escape route." "No," Lucinda said, her green eyes flashing like steel. "Not an escape route. A trap." The gunfight raged for what felt like an eternity. The stone walls of the mansion offered good cover, but Cross had them outnumbered and outgunned. Miguel and the ranch hands were pinned down in the barn and bunkhouse, their shots becoming less frequent as they tried to conserve ammunition. Inside the house, it was just Lucinda and Cade, and Rosa, who was crouched in the pantry, clutching a rosary in one hand and a cast-iron skillet in the other. "They're trying to circle around to the back," Cade said, peering through a crack in the boarded-up dining room window. "They're going to try to set fire to the kitchens." "Let them," Lucinda said, her voice eerily calm. Cade looked at her, a question in his eyes. He saw the fire in hers and understood. This wasn't just his fight anymore. They moved to the kitchen. Cade used the butt of his rifle to smash the lock on the heavy cellar door set into the floor. A wave of cool, damp air washed over them. "The tunnel is narrow," Lucinda explained. "It's a straight shot to the creek bank, about 100 yards. They won't be expecting it." "Give me a 10-minute head start," Cade said. "Then you and Rosa follow. Don't stop for anything. Miguel knows the plan. He'll create a diversion to draw their fire." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to remind Mr. Cross what happens when you corner a man with nothing left to lose," he said, his voice a low growl. He checked his pistol, then looked at her. "Thomas was a good man, Lucinda. He loved you more than anything. He made me swear on his mother's grave that I'd see you were safe." Before she could answer, he slipped down into the darkness of the cellar and was gone. Lucinda stood there, the sounds of the battle fading into a dull roar in her ears. For 3 years, she had been living in a house full of ghosts, the ghost of her husband, the ghost of their broken dreams. Now she understood the truth. Thomas hadn't been a victim. He had been a soldier, fighting a secret war, and he had sent another soldier to finish the fight. "Señora?" Rosa whispered from the pantry. "It's time." Lucinda took a deep breath. She grabbed a lantern and a box of matches. "Go," she told Rosa. "I'll be right behind you." As Rosa scrambled down into the cellar, Lucinda walked to the back door of the kitchen. She could hear Cross's men outside, splashing kerosene against the wooden walls. She waited until she heard the telltale scratch of a match. Then she opened the door. 2 of Cross's men stood there, their faces illuminated by the torch in one man's hand. Their eyes went wide with shock. Lucinda raised her father's derringer, the small, elegant pistol she hadn't fired in 10 years. "Get off my land," she said, her voice as cold as a tombstone. The man with the torch laughed. "Look what we have here. The little widow wants to play." He took a step forward. Lucinda fired. The derringer's report was small, a pop compared to the roar of the rifles, but it was deadly effective at close range. The man clutching the torch gasped, a small, dark hole appearing on his shirt, and crumpled to the ground. The torch fell, igniting the kerosene-soaked grass. The second man stared, frozen in disbelief. That moment of hesitation was all Miguel needed. A shot rang out from the barn, and the second man fell. Flames began to lick up the side of the kitchen wall. The fire was spreading fast. Lucinda didn't wait. She turned, threw the lantern into the kitchen, where it shattered and ignited the curtains, and then plunged into the darkness of the cellar, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. The tunnel was claustrophobic and smelled of damp earth and decay. She could hear Rosa ahead of her, scrambling through the darkness. Behind her, she could hear the muffled roar of the fire as it consumed her beautiful empty house. She felt no sadness. The house was a tomb. Let it burn. They emerged, gasping, into the cool air of the creek bank. The creek was low, but the thick willows and cottonwoods provided perfect cover. In the distance, they could see the mansion, flames now pouring from the windows, a giant funeral pyre against the twilight sky. The fire was the diversion. Cross and his men were all focused on the house, their backs to the creek. And that's where Cade was waiting. He moved like a phantom through the trees, silent and deadly. He was no longer a ranch hand. He was the ghost Cross had always feared. He picked off Cross's men one by one, using the chaos and the flickering firelight to his advantage. A shot from the darkness, a man falls, and then silence. Cross was screaming orders, his voice raw with panic. His perfect plan was literally going up in smoke. He had underestimated them all. He had underestimated the loyalty of Lucinda's men. He had underestimated the courage of the grieving widow. And most of all, he had underestimated the soldier Thomas Hale had sent to protect her. Lucinda watched from the creek bed, her rifle resting on a rock. She saw Cross rally his remaining men, trying to retreat from the inferno. They were heading for their horses, tethered near the main gate. But as they reached the gate, another group of riders appeared, materializing out of the darkness. These weren't ranch hands. They were professionals. Hard-faced men in dusty coats, armed with repeating rifles. At their head was a man with a cold, determined face and a silver star pinned to his vest, a U.S. Marshal. And beside the Marshal was a younger man, his face a mirror image of the lawman's, but without the badge. This man's eyes were fixed on the battle with a terrifying intensity. Lucinda recognized him. She'd seen his face on a different poster, one that had arrived in her uncle's mail a week ago. Silas Kane, a Pinkerton detective, the best in the business. The man hired by the family of the Union Captain Cade had supposedly murdered. The trap had sprung another trap. "Bartholomew Cross!" the U.S. Marshal's voice boomed. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and treason." Cross stared, his face a mask of disbelief. He was caught between Cade's phantom attacks from the creek and a line of federal lawmen at his front. His gang was decimated, his plan in ashes. But he wasn't finished. With a snarl of pure rage, he saw Lucinda across the yard, illuminated by the fire. He raised his pistol, taking aim not at Cade, not at the marshals, but at her, the source of all his problems. Before he could fire, Cade burst from the trees, covering the distance between them with impossible speed. He threw himself at Lucinda, knocking her to the ground as a bullet whistled through the air where she had been standing. Cade cried out, a sharp gasp of pain. Lucinda rolled him over. A dark stain was spreading across his side. He'd taken the bullet meant for her. The marshals and the Pinkertons opened fire, a final, deafening volley that cut down Cross and the last of his men. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the burning mansion. Lucinda cradled Cade's head in her lap, her tears falling onto his face. "Don't you dare die," she whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare. That's an order." He looked up at her, a faint, pained smile on his lips. "Yes, ma'am," he rasped, before his eyes fluttered closed. The U.S. Marshal, whose name she would learn was James Crawford, knelt beside them. "He's alive," he said, pressing a hand against Cade's wound. "But we need to get him to a doctor, now." His brother, the Pinkerton, Silas Kane, stood over them, his face unreadable. He looked down at the unconscious form of the man he had been hunting for years. Then he looked at Lucinda, at the burned-out shell of her home, at the bodies littering her yard. He slowly reached into his coat, pulled out the wanted poster for Cade McKinnon, and tore it into pieces, letting the wind carry them away into the smoke and the darkness. The case, it seemed, was closed. The aftermath was a blur of smoke, ash, and the quiet authority of federal lawmen. Marshal Crawford's arrival hadn't been an accident. Cade, in his quiet preparations, had used one of Miguel's most trusted young hands to ride not to the local town, but to the next county, carrying a message directly to the marshal's office in Austin. He'd been feeding them information for weeks, building a case against Cross that was ironclad. Sheriff Hayes, Lucinda's uncle, was arrested, his shame-faced confession coming in a flood of pathetic excuses. He had been in Cross's pocket for years, his gambling debts a leash Cross had used to lead him wherever he wanted. The truth of Captain Mallory's murder came out as well, not just from Cade's testimony, but from letters found in Cross's safe, letters that proved the frame-up beyond any doubt. The conspiracy unraveled, pulling down a dozen prominent men across 3 counties. Cade survived. The bullet had missed anything vital, and under the care of a doctor from Austin and the relentless nursing of Rosa, he slowly regained his strength. He spent his recovery in the bunkhouse, the only structure, along with the barn, to survive the fire. Lucinda's mansion was gone, a blackened stone skeleton against the Texas sky. But as she stood in the ruins, she felt no loss. The house had been a prison of memories. Now she was free. The land, scorched and scarred, was still hers. And this time, she knew what was hidden beneath it. The geological surveys, recovered from Cross's safe, confirmed it. A massive silver vein, one of the richest in the state. And more valuable than that, an underground river, a source of water that could make the drought-stricken land bloom again. She was one of the wealthiest women in Texas. One afternoon, a month after the fire, she found Cade sitting on the steps of the bunkhouse, staring out at the land. "We have a lot of rebuilding to do," she said, sitting beside him. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice still a little weak. "I'm going to need a good foreman, a partner, in fact," she continued, looking him straight in the eye. "Someone I can trust, someone who knows the land. I'm offering 50% of everything." Cade was silent for a long time. He looked at the ruins of her home, at the graves of the men who had died defending it, then back at her. "Lucinda," he said, using her first name for the first time. "I'm a drifter, a man with a ghost of a name." "Your name is cleared," she said softly. "The government has issued a full pardon, and an apology. "You're a hero, Cade." "I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who tried to keep a promise." "Then help me keep another one," she said. "My husband and I dreamed of what this ranch could be. A place of prosperity, of sanctuary. Help me build it." He looked at her, and in his pale blue eyes, she saw the walls he had built around his own heart begin to crumble. He had come here to protect her legacy, and in doing so, had found a future of his own. She extended a hand. "Partners?" He didn't shake it. He took her hand in his touch gentle, and raised it to his lips. "Partners," he agreed. They rebuilt. But they didn't build another grand, lonely mansion. They built a comfortable, sprawling ranch house, with a porch that wrapped all the way around and enough rooms for the family they planned to have. They used the newfound wealth from the silver and the water to help the other ranchers in the area who had been crushed by cross and the drought, creating a community bound by loyalty and shared survival. One cool autumn evening, a year later, they stood together watching the first herd of cattle branded with their new mark. It wasn't the old Hale brand or a new McKinnon one. It was a simple, elegant design that intertwined an H and an M. The hungry giant who had appeared at her gate had given her back her life, and the lonely widow who had offered a meal out of pity had given him a home. The bargain had been struck, and both of them had received far more than they had ever dared to hope for. Their story became a legend in that part of Texas, a story of how sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried under the ground, but are found in the strength of a promise, the courage of a conviction, and the heart of a person willing to fight for what's right. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption in the Old West, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the stories we have coming your way are just as wild. And let us know in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Lucinda's shoes? Until next time, stay safe, and watch out for the quiet strangers who show up at your door. You never know what secrets they might be hiding.